James Holloway had just returned home after a grueling day in court. As a federal prosecutor, his job was relentless, facing criminals, dissecting lies, and ensuring justice prevailed. But at home, that was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where he wasn't cross-examining witnesses or arguing legal precedents. Tonight, he wanted nothing more than a cold drink and silence. As he stepped into his luxurious penthouse in downtown Chicago, the city skyline twinkled through the massive glass windows. The weight of the day lifted slightly as he loosened his tie, tossing his leather briefcase onto the granite counter. Then, a loud, aggressive knock shattered the tranquility. Not the casual tap of a neighbor, not even the firm knock of a delivery guy. No, this was something else, something urgent. James's instincts, honed from years of court battles, flared to life. He strode toward the door, rolling his sleeves up, his pulse steadied, his mind sharpening. Something was off. Peering through the peephole, he saw them, two men in dark uniforms standing rigidly, clipboards in hand. Their expressions screamed authority, but James knew better. This was no official visit. James Holloway opened the door just enough to lean against the frame, arms crossed, his piercing gaze locked on the two men standing outside. Both were dressed in black tactical-style uniforms, cheap polyester material, boots too clean, fake badges pinned to their chests that read, Metro Property Enforcement. They weren't cops, but they were trying very hard to look like it. The taller one, a wiry man with slicked back hair and an angular face, cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway?" James didn't confirm or deny. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, sizing them up. "Depends. Who's asking?" The second man, shorter, bulkier, with a shaved head and a forced scowl, stepped forward, radiating fake confidence. "We're with Metro Property Enforcement. You're in violation of city code, and we're here to conduct an inspection." James raised an eyebrow. "Inspection?" The shorter man puffed out his chest. "You've been reported for multiple code violations, and under emergency enforcement procedures, you need to vacate the premises immediately while we conduct a compliance check." James let out a small, incredulous laugh. They had no idea who they were messing with. "Really? What violations?" he asked, amusement creeping into his tone. The taller man glanced at his clipboard, flipping through pages like he actually had real documentation. "Unregistered renovations, structural instability, possible hazardous materials." He clicked his pen dramatically. "Failure to comply will result in immediate eviction." James's smirk vanished. His stance straightened, and his prosecutor instincts kicked in. "You do realize," he said slowly, "that forced evictions without due process are a felony?" The two men exchanged a glance, irritation flickering in their eyes. The shorter one tried again. "Look, we're authorized to—" "No, you're not," James interrupted, his voice dropping to a controlled, lethal calm. "And I'm giving you about 5 seconds to explain why you're standing here before I charge you with criminal trespassing, impersonating an officer, and attempted fraud." A flicker of uncertainty passed over the taller man's face. But then, the worst mistake they could make. The shorter one stepped closer. "Sir, you need to leave. Now." His hand moved to his belt, reaching for something, a piece of paper. He yanked it out and held it up dramatically. James took it, reading it in an instant. The formatting was wrong. No legal header, no city seal, completely fake. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Wow," he muttered. "You really thought this would work?" The shorter man squared his shoulders. "You have 10 minutes to get out." James's smile was gone. His eyes hardened. "I'll give you one last chance to walk away," he warned. Silence. Then, the shorter man lunged for James's phone. Wrong move. The moment the shorter man lunged for James's phone, everything changed. James saw the movement before it happened. Years of courtroom experience had trained him to read people, to predict their next move. His body reacted before his mind even processed it. With a swift motion, he sidestepped, letting the man's momentum carry him forward. The would-be enforcer stumbled past him, off balance, and that's when James struck. Crack! His forearm collided with the man's wrist, knocking the phone-snatching hand away. The clipboard clattered to the ground, papers scattering like confetti. James stepped forward, pressing his advantage, voice dropping into that quiet, lethal tone that made even seasoned criminals sweat. "Big mistake." The shorter man snarled, regaining his footing, but James didn't give him a chance to attack again. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it just enough to make him wince, and yanked him off balance. The taller man, the so-called brains of the operation, panicked. "Hey, you can't—" James cut him off with a glare so sharp it might as well have been a blade. "Try me." The taller one hesitated, just a second too long. James reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. Not a fake one like theirs. A real federal prosecutor's badge. He held it up for them to see, his voice like steel. "You two just assaulted a federal officer. You know what that means?" Silence. The shorter man stopped struggling. The taller man's face drained of color. James let the silence hang in the air, letting them stew in it. Then he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down their spines. "It means you just bought yourselves a first-class ticket to a maximum security prison." The shorter man licked his lips, his eyes darting toward the door like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. "Look," he stammered, "this is just a misunderstanding." James laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Misunderstanding?" He gestured to the fake eviction notice, the plastic badges, the clipboard full of nonsense. "You came to my house, tried to force me out with a fake eviction, impersonated law enforcement, and then attacked me." James took a step closer, forcing them both to back up. "I put people like you away for a living." Then, in the distance, a sound that changed everything. Wailing sirens. The real police were coming. The taller man froze. The shorter one panicked. James took one last look at them, then lifted his phone, pointing the camera directly at their faces. Smile for the evidence. And just like that, their scam was over. The moment the sirens blared through the street, everything shifted. The two fake officers, once so confident, so in control, suddenly weren't. Their eyes darted toward the window, their fake bravado crumbling as the red and blue lights reflected off the glass. James watched them crack. The taller one, the so-called mastermind, took a shaky step back, his jaw clenching as if trying to come up with a last-minute excuse. The shorter one, the enforcer, was already sweating, his fingers twitching like he was deciding whether to make a run for it. "This is your last chance," James said, voice dangerously low. "You can stay and deal with the cops, or you can tell me exactly who sent you." The shorter one snapped first. "Look, man, we didn't know who you were, okay?" His voice was frantic now, no longer full of false authority. "We were just hired." James narrowed his eyes. "By who?" The taller man glared at his partner, but it was too late. The con was falling apart. "Some guy named Vance," the shorter man blurted. "He runs these scams all over the city. Pays guys like us to pose as property enforcement, scare people into leaving, and then flips their houses for cash. James's jaw tightened. A serial scammer? That meant this wasn't just a one-time con. The sirens grew louder. The taller man suddenly bolted for the door. Wrong move. Bam! James grabbed his wrist mid-stride, spun him around, and slammed him face first against the wall. The man grunted in pain, trying to struggle, but James had handled far worse in his time. He pressed his forearm against the guy's back, pinning him easily. The shorter man raised his hands, shaking his head violently. Hey, no need for that, okay? I'm cooperating. James ignored him. He turned his head slightly toward the door, where the real law enforcement had finally arrived. 2 uniformed officers stormed in, hands on their holsters. Everything all right here? The lead cop asked, scanning the scene. His eyes landed on James, recognizing him instantly. James flashed his badge. Federal Prosecutor James Holloway. He nodded toward the pinned man. These 2 tried to impersonate law enforcement, run a fake eviction scam, and attacked a government officer. The second cop exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Unbelievable. The officers took over, snapping handcuffs onto the scammers, reading them their Miranda rights. The shorter man was visibly shaking. Come on, man. We didn't mean any real harm. James chuckled darkly. Tell it to the judge. As they were dragged outside, the taller man snarled, his final words dripping with venom. This isn't over. James smirked. Oh, I know. As the fake officers were shoved into the back of the squad car, James Holloway stood on his doorstep, watching them squirm. The taller one, his so-called mastermind, glared daggers at James. The shorter one? Already breaking down, his face pale, his knee bouncing anxiously. James had seen it 100 times before. Men who thought they were untouchable until they weren't. The lead officer, Sergeant Walker, turned to James. Want to press charges? James smirked. Oh, I'm pressing every single charge I can. Walker nodded. We'll take them in. Want to meet us at the precinct? James tapped his chin, thinking. There was something bigger at play here. His mind replayed the name the scammer had given up. Vance. Actually, James said slowly, I want to know more about this Vance guy. Walker's expression darkened. Yeah, we've heard that name before. James raised an eyebrow. So he's a repeat offender? Walker sighed. More than that, he's been running property scams for years. Fake evictions, fraudulent deeds, squatter takeovers. But every time we get close, he disappears. James felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just a couple of low-level grifters trying to make a quick buck. This was an entire operation. He turned to the squad car, where the shorter man, clearly the weaker link, was staring at him, panic in his eyes. James took a calculated step forward, resting his hands on the door. Hey, he said, voice casual. You want to cut a deal? The man blinked rapidly. What? James leaned in slightly. You work for Vance, right? Tell me everything you know, and maybe I can make things easier for you. The taller scammer snapped. Don't say a damn word! James didn't even look at him. His focus stayed on the panicked man, who was clearly debating his options. You think Vance is going to bail you out? James continued, his voice soft but sharp as a blade. You think he cares that you're about to take the fall while he walks free? The shorter man's mouth opened, then closed. James delivered the final blow. Because I promise you this, if you don't talk now, by the time Vance is caught, you'll already be serving 10 years. Silence. Then, I'll talk, the man mumbled. James smiled, stepping back. Hook, line, sinker. Walker smirked. You just can't turn it off, huh? James shrugged. You know me, Walker. I don't like unfinished business. And just like that, this wasn't just a home invasion anymore. It was a full-scale takedown. James Holloway leaned back in his leather office chair, fingers tapping rhythmically on his polished mahogany desk. The air smelled of fresh coffee and printer ink, the usual scent of justice in progress. Before him, a thick case file lay open, Vance. The name now carried weight. It wasn't just a whispered rumor among con artists. It was the key to a much bigger operation. The confession from the fake officer had blown the lid off something huge. Vance wasn't just some low-level grifter. He was an architect of fraud, fake evictions, forged property deeds, strong-arm tactics to scare homeowners into fleeing so he could take over their homes and sell them for profit. It was organized crime, hiding behind the thin veil of legality. And James? He was going to bring it all crashing down. The next morning, he met with Detective Sarah Lawson, an old ally from his days working organized crime cases. She dropped a fat folder on the table between them. Vance's operation. Everything we've got. James flipped it open. Pages upon pages of fraud. Dozens of victims. And yet, no convictions. He always slipped through. James scanned the reports. How the hell has this guy stayed untouchable? Lawson exhaled sharply. Every time we build a case, our witnesses disappear. Either they get scared off, or they just vanish. James's jaw tightened. This wasn't just fraud. It was a calculated system of fear and manipulation. He looked up at Lawson. Well, he screwed up this time. He sent his guys to the wrong house. She smirked. The house of a prosecutor. James nodded. I'm making this personal. Lawson leaned forward, her eyes sharp. You ready to go all in? James grinned. Oh, I'm already in. That night, James sat in his dimly lit home office, legal pads scattered across the desk, his mind racing. Every case had a weak spot. Vance's was his confidence. He had gotten away with this for years, untouchable because people were too scared to fight back. But James wasn't. He reached for his phone, dialing Walker's number. The sergeant answered on the first ring. Holloway? James's voice was calm but charged with purpose. I need an arrest warrant. A pause. Then, for who? James looked at the case file, his fingers tightening on the edge of the paper. For the man who thinks he's untouchable. Vance. This wasn't just about his home anymore. This was about taking down a predator. 3 days later, James Holloway stood outside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, his breath steady despite the chill in the night air. The place was Vance's headquarters, a shell company registered to a fake name, the heart of his entire operation. Tonight, it would all come crashing down. Red and blue lights flickered in the distance. Inside, Vance sat in his office, oblivious to the storm about to hit him. He was a man in his late 40s, arrogant and untouchable, reclining in a leather chair, counting stacks of money. Another easy payday, another home stolen. Then, boom! The warehouse doors burst open. FBI, hands where we can see them! The room exploded with movement. Agents flooded in, weapons drawn. Vance's men scrambled, but there was nowhere to run. Vance froze, his eyes darting, looking for an escape. But there was none. And then he saw him. James Holloway stepped through the chaos, his calm, unshaken presence cutting through the panic like a knife. Vance's face twisted in recognition. You, he spat. James smiled coldly. Me. 2 officers grabbed Vance, slamming him against the desk as they locked the cuffs around his wrists. "Wait! Wait!" Vance yelled, his confidence cracking. "I've got money. We can work something out." James leaned in slightly, his voice a razor's edge. "You've spent years scamming innocent people out of their homes," he said. "But when your own doors get kicked in, now you want mercy?" Vance's eyes widened as the realization hit. This was over. James pulled out his phone and held up the screen. "You recognize this guy?" On the screen was the mugshot of the scammer James had arrested earlier, the one who had flipped on Vance. Vance's face drained of color. "Oh, and one more thing," James smirked. "I'll be the one prosecuting your case." The cops dragged Vance out, his shouts of protest fading into the night. A week later, James sat in his courtroom, staring at a thick case file labeled U.S. vs. Vance. Justice was finally catching up. The irony wasn't lost on him. Vance had built his empire on fear, using fake authority to bully people out of their homes. But in the end, the real law had taken everything from him. James let out a slow breath, his eyes scanning the evidence one last time before signing off on the charges. Some cases took months, some took years. But then, every once in a while, there were the rare gems, the ones that solved themselves. James Holloway's story is a powerful reminder of one thing: knowledge is power. Vance and his crew thrived on fear and deception. They counted on people not knowing their rights, not questioning authority, and not fighting back. That's how scams work. But the moment they picked the wrong target, a man who knew the law inside and out, their entire scheme crumbled in an instant. This happens in real life all the time. Fake landlords, scam eviction notices, fraudulent debt collectors, people using intimidation and false authority to steal what doesn't belong to them. But here's the truth: they only win if you let them. If James had panicked and left his home, he would have lost everything. Instead, he stood his ground, questioned everything, and made sure justice was served. The lesson: never take anything at face value. If someone claims to have legal power over you, demand proof, know your rights, and if something feels off, it probably is. Because in the end, the real law always wins. If you ever find yourself in a situation where someone is trying to intimidate you with fake authority, 1. Stay calm. Fear makes people compliant. Scammers want you to panic. Don't. 2. Ask for credentials. A real official will have proper documentation, not a cheap badge and a clipboard. 3. Verify everything. Look up local laws. Call the real authorities if you're unsure. Record the interaction. A simple video can shut down a scam in seconds. 5. Know your rights. In most countries, landlords, debt collectors, and HOA enforcers cannot forcefully remove you without a court order. Just like James, you don't have to be a prosecutor to defend yourself against fraud. You just need to be informed and prepared. Because knowledge isn't just power, it's protection. Have you ever encountered a scam like this? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more real-life legal takedowns.